Ladies and gentlemen, have you sorted out women's rights? I hope you've sorted out women's rights with your neighbours. And welcome to the Convict Club, and welcome to tonight's discussion. And we have to be honest, this is one of the most miserable subjects that you can talk about. It really is. And I find it really hard, and I'm sure many of you do too. But we're not going to let you go, I'm telling you this now, without some hope, because there is some hope, as well as all the terrible stories that we have to hear. We're going to talk about rape, sexual violence as a crime of war. And we have with us two people who are incredibly well qualified to talk about this terrible subject. One is Christina Lamb. She is the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times, and she's written a book on this subject, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield. And I mean, I have to salute Christina for doing this book. When she first told me that she was going to do it, I was like, well, how can you bear it? And she said, because it's so important, and because this is what we've come across all our lives, and that's true. I mean, I should have introduced myself. I'm Lindsey Hilsum, the international editor of Channel 4 News, and I've been in many of the same places as Christina, seeing all of these terrible things, but I didn't have the dedication that she has had to write this incredible book. And then we have Philippe Sands. Now, Philippe is an international barrister. He is an expert on war crimes, on genocide, and he is the person who's going to give us some hope, because one of the issues is about impunity. And Philippe is going to tell us something about how we can end impunity for the people who commit this terrible war crime. And so we have an hour and a quarter, so we're going to talk for a bit, and then we'll open up to questions. So in Christina's book, one of the things that really struck me at the beginning was how she describes that rape, sexual violence, is often seen as a private crime. But it is as much a weapon of war as the machete, the club, or the Kalashnikov. And I think that that's an incredibly eloquent way of putting it. And that is the basis of what we're going to talk about tonight. So, Christina, let me turn to you first.
Thanks, Lindsey, and great to be here. Thanks so many people for coming, and I feel very honoured to be between Lindsey and Philippe, who are both amazing people and very good friends. So I hope we'll have a very interesting discussion. So I was just going to start by just reading a short passage. They put the names in the bowl and began to draw them out. 10 names, 10 girls. The girls quivered like kittens caught under a dripping tap. For them, this was no lucky dip. The men pulling out the slips of paper were fighters from Islamic State, and each would take a girl as a slave. Naima stared at her hands, blood pounding in her ears. The girl next to her was younger than her, about 14, and mewling with fear. But when Naima tried to hold her hand, one of the men whipped off his belt and lashed them apart. That man was older and larger than the others, around 60, she guessed, with a belly cascading over his trousers and a vicious curl to his lips. By then, she had been 9 months in captivity of Islamic State. She knew none of them were kind, but she prayed this one didn't pick her name. Naima. The man who read out her name was Abu Danun. He looked younger, almost like her brother, the hair on his chin still fluff. Maybe he would have less cruelty in his heart. The draw continued. The fat man picked out the young girl next to her. But then he said something to the others in Arabic, pulled out 2 crisp $100 notes and slapped them onto the table. Abu Danun shrugged, pocketed the money, and handed over his slip of paper. Minutes later, the fat man was shoving her into his black Land Cruiser and driving through the streets of Mosul, a city she had once dreamed of visiting, but which was now the capital of these monsters who had swept into her homeland and abducted her and 6 of her brothers and sisters, among thousands of others. She stared through the tinted windows. An old man sitting on a cart was whipping a donkey to jerk it forward, and people were out shopping, though the only women in the streets were in black hijab. It was strange to see everyday life still going on for other people, almost like watching a movie. Her captor was an Iraqi called Abdul Hasib, and he was a mullah. The religious ones were the worst. He did everything to me, she later recounted. Hitting me, sex, pulling my hair, sex, everything. I was refusing, so he forced me and hit me. He said, "You are my sabaya, my slave." After that, I just lay there and tried to float my mind above my body as if it were happening to someone else, so he couldn't steal all of me. He had 2 wives and a daughter, but they did nothing to help me. In between pleasing him, I would have to do all the housework. Once I was washing dishes, and one of the wives came and made me take a tablet, some kind of Viagra. Her only respite came every 10 days when the mullah went to Syria to visit the other part of their caliphate. After a month or so, Abdul Hasib sold her for $4,500 to another Iraqi called Abu Allah, a healthy prophet. Abu Allah ran a cement factory and had 2 wives and 9 children. 2 of his sons were fighters with ISIS. It was the same thing, she said, forcing me to have sex. But then he took me to the house of his friend, Abu Suleiman, and sold me for $8,000. Abu Suleiman sold me to Abu Dawood for $12,000. He kept me for a week. Then he sold me to Abu Faisal, who was a bomb maker in Mosul. He kept me of 20 days of raping, then sold me to Abu Badr. In the end, she was sold to 12 different men. She lists them one by one, their nom de guerre and real name, even their children's names, all of which she had committed to memory, for she was determined they would pay. To be sold like that, from one to another, as if we were goats, was the worst, she said. I tried to kill myself, to throw myself out of a car. Another time, I found some tablets and took the lot. But still, I woke up. I felt even death didn't want me.
That's absolutely horrendous, Christina. So the woman you're writing about there, she's a Yazidi, right? Tell us a bit about the Yazidis.
So the Yazidis, so this was really the first time I came across this issue on a big scale. So in 2015, I was covering the refugee crisis in Europe, and I was in a refugee camp in a Greek island called Leros, a very small island. And I went to talk to some of the refugees, women, and they wanted to meet me away from the camp in what was actually the ruins of a mental asylum. And it was a very eerie place. It was full of, the roof was all coming apart, and there were lots of holes in the floor, and all these abandoned old rusted iron beds. And this place had actually had a reputation as being the worst mental asylum in Europe. And I knew that. So I go to talk to these people. I know nothing about them, just that they're refugees from Iraq. And it was clear that something absolutely terrible had happened to them, and I didn't know what. And they started speaking. And one of the things that was so weird to me was a lot of them had children, and they weren't watching what the children were doing. The kids were almost falling down these holes, and they weren't taking any notice. It was like they were kind of disconnected from what was happening. So after a while, one of them showed me a video on her phone, and it was one of the most horrific things I'd ever seen, which was of women in a cage being set fire to, and all these men standing around and kind of jeering. And I couldn't really even work out what it was. And she said to me, "That's my sister. They were burning virgins." And so she told me that they were Islamic State fighters that had taken these women, and that all of the women that I'd met had been taken and had been taken to a place called the Galaxy Cinema in Mosul, which was literally like a sort of latter-day slave market, where they'd been separated into so-called ugly and beautiful. And then the fighters would come and touch their hair, touch their breasts, and decide which one they wanted to take. And so these young women had all been abducted. They'd managed eventually to escape in different ways. Some of them had been bought back by relatives, and so they were fleeing. And so when they told me these stories, I had never heard anything like it. And they then told me that quite a lot of them had been taken to Germany, and a particular province of Germany had taken them called Baden-Württemberg, and that I could go and meet some of them there. So this state in Germany had taken about 1,000 of these girls. So I went there and spoke to more, and again, really horrific stories. And I was baffled because actually these women were all telling their stories and we were writing about it. And these are really hard stories to tell. You heard that story I just read. I mean, they're so personal and they're like the worst thing that could happen to you. And yet nobody was doing anything. And one of the girls I interviewed sent me a message after I sent her my article, and she said, "We told our story, but what difference does it make?" And I couldn't answer the question, and I felt very uncomfortable. And at the same time, I was going a lot to Nigeria, because you probably remember in 2014, the Chibok girls that were abducted from their school in the middle of the night by Boko Haram fighters. Again, more than 200 of them. And so I went, like many people. Did you go to that? So, and it was like the biggest story on earth for 2 weeks, and then everybody forgot about it. And actually, more than half of those girls are still missing 9 years on. And so I traveled around northeast Nigeria and discovered that actually this was like the tip of the iceberg, that tens of thousands of girls and women had been taken. So again, you know, this is really big scale. And then 2 years after that, 2017, I was in Bangladesh when the Rohingya people were fleeing Burma or Myanmar because the Burmese military and Buddhist militias were coming into their villages, setting fire to their huts, often killing the men. And around 700,000 people fled over 3 months into Bangladesh, and I went there to interview people. Most of them were women and children, and every single woman I met told me stories about being dragged from their huts and tied to a banana tree and gang raped by these soldiers. So again, they were telling their stories. Again, it was a huge number of people, and again, nothing was happening. So I just became very angry about it and started to, you know, kind of research more about the legal side and why nobody seemed to be brought to justice for it. And that's how I ended up writing this book. I didn't set out to write a book. I just wanted to answer the question of that Yazidi girl, of what difference does it make telling our story?
So this is the moment to go to Philippe. What difference does it make? Because sexual assault or rape was not a war crime until quite recently, was it? Can you tell us a little bit of the background to this?
I just also incredibly nice to be here with the two of you and here at the Conduit with everybody. I'll move to a little bit of historical context momentarily, but just to segue straight from what Christina has said, I was also involved with that community in Baden-Württemberg. As you probably know, the program to bring 1,200 young women and girls, some of them were incredibly young, to Baden-Württemberg was driven by a psychologist called Hilsum, who is German, Turkish, Kurdish, and Yazidi. And he had got in touch with me on the basis of writings that I had done, a couple of books that I'd written, because he wanted advice on the route of criminal justice. And the reason that he wanted advice on the route of criminal justice was precisely that in the psychological program that he was putting in place with many of the people that you met and that I met, and the stories were as shocking as anything I have ever heard, the idea that there could be a path to justice in some way was a central part of his psychological program. And he wanted help from someone who could explain the different crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, which are the three international crimes of our modern day put into our international statute books across the world since 1945 and Nuremberg. And so the simple answer to your question, you're right in response to that question that was put to you, what's happened? But actually some things are happening and some things are in train. And just to highlight that the country that is doing more than any is Germany. And that, and it'll be a constant theme of what I say, individuals make a real difference, the German federal prosecutor Peter Frank. Because, as Peter Frank said to me, I come from a country that knows about these things. There is nothing new about what is going on. Perhaps the scale differs, perhaps the details differ, but essentially these kinds of stories that Christina has just been talking about have gone on since time immemorial. And he said, I, as a German, with a sense of responsibility for my country's past, feels that it is incredibly important to do justice. And there have been cases, and there have been trials, and there have been convictions for rape as an act of genocide and as a crime against humanity in the domestic courts of Germany. Britain, by contrast, has done nothing. Let us not forget that. Germany is the country that has acted on this issue. It's not enough. It's the tip of a huge iceberg, but it's not nothing. So to put these issues into context, if you go back to 1945 and the moment that I wrote about in East West Street, you will have noticed that basically all of the people that I wrote about as actors in the process that elaborated our modern system of international criminal justice, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, were men, every single one of them, without exception. The design of the system that came into being, war crimes as a concept, misbehavior in terms of methods and means of warfare, targeting civilians and so on and so forth, it's the only one that exists since the 19th century. Basically, largely invented, ironically enough, given what's going on in Ukraine, by a group of Russian jurists. Russia has a very significant and positive role to play in the elaboration of modern international criminal law and war crimes. Crimes against humanity, the systematic destruction of individuals, so war crimes plus, and genocide, the destruction of groups, only came onto the statute books in the summer of 1945. It's very recent. And if you look at the definition of the crimes in the Nuremberg Statute in 1945, you will see no reference to rape or, and I think it's really important to put the conversation on rape into a broader context, no reference to any sex-related crimes, including male-to-male rape, because a lot of that goes on and no one is talking about that. That's yet to come in terms of international criminal law. So you go through the Nuremberg proceedings, you go through the judgment of Nuremberg. In the judgment of Nuremberg, I checked it again last night just to be sure, not a single reference to rape, not a single reference to sex crimes, nothing. It's not that they didn't happen, but no one wanted to talk about that kind of stuff. And for those of you who've read East West Street, you will know that one of my four characters, Raphael Lemkin, I'm pretty sure, well, I know, was gay. What is the one crime he does not include, the one group he doesn't include in his identification of groups for his definition of genocide? It was what would have been called in his period homosexuals. On the thesis, which I'm sure was right, that at that point it was bad enough to be a Jew, pretty bad to be a Pole, to be gay on top of it would have just cast him into the wilderness, so he just kept quiet about it. And in his book, Axis Rule, there is no reference to the persecutions of homosexuals. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary omission. It is not an accidental omission. It is a strategic omission intended to get him to the top table. Do I criticize him for that? Absolutely not. It's better that he got onto the top table and started the whole thing going, but it's an incomplete list of crimes. Interestingly, Brazil has recently become the first country to include in its domestic legislation on genocide the targeting of groups on the basis of sexual orientation, but it's not generally included. For 50 years, nothing happened. And it was only, and I don't know whether it's cause and effect because you guys came on the scene and just suddenly got involved, rape and other sex-related crimes came onto the agenda into the 1990s. But it didn't happen by statutory act. It happened as, it wasn't states suddenly deciding they wanted to put this issue on the agenda. It was individuals, a number of really crucial, mostly but not all women, who were negotiators, who were drafters, and who were judges. And I just want to single out one in particular. I mean, I think it's really also worth mentioning Madeleine Albright, who in the definitions of the statutes of the ICTY and the ICTR on war crimes and crimes against humanity, but not genocide, went out of her way to include sex-related crimes, including the crime of rape, and moved to put that onto the agenda. But for me, the most significant individual is a South African judge called Navi Pillay, who sat in a case called Akayesu, prosecutor versus Akayesu, and who received the written evidence and then the oral arguments in relation to acts of genocide taking place in Rwanda, and said to counsel, why are you not addressing sex-related crimes? Why are you not addressing rape? Which I understand is taking place on or took place.
It was actually, I mean, one of the, because it's so right about it too, in the case against Akayesu, which wasn't for sexual violence, right, to start with, one of the witnesses started talking about rape, and one of the other judges, one of the other international judges in this court literally said to her, why are you talking about rape? Like, we're not interested in that. And it was
a male judge.
Yeah, a male judge. And it was Navi Pillay who said, hang on a minute, this person has come all the way here to testify, and at least we could hear her story.
But she went beyond.
Yeah,
and she went. So can I interrupt for a minute? I was the first witness in the Akayesu trial. Because the Akayesu trial was the first, it was the first trial for genocide in Rwanda. And it just so happens that I was the first witness, not to rape, but to what was happening, because I had been in Rwanda as the genocide unfolded. And I put aside, a lot of journalists would disapprove of this, but I decided that being a witness at this trial was more important than what some people think journalists should do. I basically felt that if all these people from Rwanda were going to get up, had the guts to stand up and say what happened, then I would have the guts too. So anyway, it just so happens I was the first witness in that trial.
And it's interesting because I think people often think the first convictions were Bosnia because there was so much talk, but it was actually this.
But I think for you to understand how things happen, these things don't just, it's not a group of governments coming together and deciding we're going to address with this. As with Lauterpacht and Lemkin on crimes against humanity and genocide, it's about an individual having, in her case, a particular experience of life in South Africa as a person of colour, knowing some of the things that were going on, bringing to the table in the courtroom those experiences and saying, I'm instructing you to go back to the evidence, and I want to see evidence systematically reported with transcripts, with testimony, with witness statements about what was happening in relation to sex crimes in Rwanda. And that then came back. And what Navi Pillay then shepherded through in the judgment for the first time was rape as an act of genocide. Why an act of genocide? Because, as Christina and Lindsey know so well, there is method behind what is going on. This is not a bunch of blokes going off and finding a few women that they can do really appalling things to. This is on instructions from on high, because the community that you met will have said to you, as they said to me, once that had been done to us, we could not go back to our homes and produce children who would be recognized as part of the community. So it is an instrument to destroy groups. And Navi Pillay was the person who saw that and put that on the statute books. And we can come back maybe in the conversation on the balance between the different crimes and how you characterize them, which is not without significance.
So is that the moment when rape becomes a war crime? So I
No,
haven't
it was a
completely
war crime before that.
Before.
It was already in the ICTY and ICTR statute.
So ICTY, ICTR.
So you've
It
got
was
to
the
keep
first
in-
conviction.
You've got to keep in your minds these three different crimes, okay? I don't have them on a hierarchy. I don't have a Premier League of horror. For me, they're all equally terrible.
Yeah, sure.
But war crime is the oldest. Starts really in modern parlance in the 1860s in St. Petersburg, and it's targeting civilians in times of war, which you're not allowed to do. And originally, until 1945, that didn't include sex-related crimes. Then the second crime that comes along is crimes against humanity, an invention of Hersch Lauterpacht, professor at Cambridge, who persuades Robert Jackson to include it in the Nuremberg Statute, the systematic targeting of civilians. It doesn't include crimes of a sexual nature. But in 1993, 1994, with the drafting of the statutes of the ICTY and the ICTR...
That's the tribunal on Yugoslavia and on Rwanda. Yeah.
Makes it into the statutes and becomes part of the prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but not genocide. And the genocide moment is incredibly significant, and I'll explain why by reference to my conversations with this remarkable psychologist, Jan Kieselhan. I wrote a long piece for the Financial Times magazine about it in about 2015 or so, which you can find its own access. And he didn't want what happened to the people you met to be characterized as war crime or crime against humanity. He wanted it to be characterized as genocide. Why? And we had long debates about this. I spent a long time trying to say to him, crime against humanity is not less bad than genocide. And he said, because genocide is the only one of the crimes in which a central element is the intention to destroy a group. And there's a double aspect, women and Yazidis. And prosecuting it as genocide is psychologically important because it allows the people who've been on the receiving end of these horrors to understand that the international community respects them in a double sense as a group of women who are entitled to exist as women and as a group of Yazidis who are entitled to exist as Yazidis, not just as individual human beings. I mean, all of this goes back to a central theme of East-West Street, the relationship between the individual and the group.
But I think that that's really, and I'm going to cover it, and that's really important in terms of Rwanda as well, because the rape in Rwanda was very systematic. It was a rape of Tutsi women to stop their children, so that their children should not be regarded as Tutsis anymore, because it was a genocide. It was an attempt at wiping out a group which was the Tutsis. But I want to go back further, Christina, because so we're talking about the modern age, but in your book, you go way back, don't you? How far do you go back?
Well, I mean, there's always been rape in war, right? But, I mean, what I was writing about, so, go back to the ancient Persians, the Greeks, you look at Herodotus, it opens, the very first book of Western history opens with abductions of women, or the Iliad starts with abductions of women. So, it's not something that wasn't known about. But what I think is different is in the cases that I've looked at, it was very much used as a deliberate weapon of war. And so, whereas in some, people and people said this to me when I said I was going to write a book about rape in war, people said, well, there's always been rape in war. And, the sort of breakdown of society, rape, looting, pillage, and I was like, well, even if there has always been rape in war, we are in 2023 now. It doesn't mean that it's all right to do it now, but I also just was struck at, in many of these cases, so for the Yazidis, for example, Islamic State fighters were instructed to take them, and it was actually documented. They even issued instructions of how to treat your sabaya and your slave and what you can and can't do. And when they traded one to another, they had sort of almost legal documents as if they were selling a car or something.
But take us back to World War II, because, I know we were talking earlier. Tell us a bit about the comfort women and also about the Russians, because this is very interesting, about the systematic nature of this in World War II as well.
Well, Philippe mentioned Nuremberg, and I get quite cross when people have written articles about what's happening in Ukraine at the moment and saying we need another Nuremberg to prosecute. And I'm like, actually, we really don't need another Nuremberg, because that completely ignored what happened to the women and the sexual violence. And I mean, it happened on all sides, but the main two things were what the Russians did during the liberation of Berlin. If you've read Anthony Beevor's amazing book on Berlin, he writes about this, and he estimates about 2 million women were raped by Russian soldiers. And it's interesting, the Yazidis say to me that when the Islamic State fighters came and they were trying to make themselves look uglier by kind of putting ashes on their face and in their hair. And that's exactly what women in Berlin did back in 1945. So it's very chilling to hear that again.
But also the other thing that's extraordinary is that he wrote that book in 2002, and it hadn't really come out before then.
I mean, because, well, so this is the most awful thing, and I mean, women here will appreciate this, that rape is the one crime where the victim is made to feel as if they did something wrong. I think we all know the very poor conviction rates in this country, right? Less than 2% of reported rapes last year led to any kind of prosecution. So if that's happening here in this country, then imagine in places like the Yazidis where they didn't have access to lawyers and media and money to prosecute. So, people were made to feel it's their fault what happened to them, which is so wrong. And so that some of the women that did speak out what happened at the end of the war, there was a woman wrote a book actually called A Woman in Berlin, which was taken out of publication. Lots of women committed suicide. It was really, they were made to feel that this was something you couldn't talk about. And it's exactly the same with what happened to women in Southeast Asia, the so-called comfort women that were taken by the Imperial Japanese Army. And I went to the Philippines to talk to some of the women there. Of course, there are not many people still surviving because it's a very long time ago now, but I met this amazing group. They call themselves the Lolas, which means grandmothers, and they don't like the term comfort women. These are women in their late 80s, and such dignified women who basically were taken, some of them hadn't even reached puberty, were taken by Japanese soldiers to these so-called comfort stations where they had to service soldiers, and sometimes as many as 50 in a day, just horrendous stories. And at the end of the war, they couldn't talk about it because they nobody would have married them, nobody would have spoken to them. They were considered, also there was this attempt to make it seem like they were complicit, that they were prostitutes. And so these women had to hide this for so many years. And eventually, in the 90s, one woman came out and spoke about it on the radio, Rosa. And the other women said to me they just couldn't believe when she spoke about it. And then some of them started to come forward. And in many cases, their own families were like, horrified, and why are you speaking about this, and you're bringing shame onto our family. But these women are really brave, and there's a small group, they go to the presidency every year to try and get, because not only have these women never had justice, but they didn't even have acknowledgement of what happened to them. If you read the history books in the Philippines, there is no mention of what happened to these women. The Japanese, there's a massive denialist movement in Japan now. And in fact, I was just saying to Lindsey, I got an email from Lila Pilipino, which is the group that represents these women today, very upset because there's a report on human rights in Japan, and there is no mention, again, of what the Japanese did to these women. And in fact, one of the women, she made me laugh because she said that she goes to this place where tourists go for these sort of ruins in Manila. And she tries to tell them what happened and what really happened, and sort of like butts into their tours. And I think they just think she's this mad woman. But these women, I mean, you just think about it. They have been for more than 75 years fighting for justice, and they know that they will almost certainly die without ever seeing justice. And we can talk about this, but I mean, justice obviously means different things to different people. It doesn't necessarily mean actually seeing your perpetrator in front of you in a courtroom. It can just mean acknowledgement of what happened to them. But unfortunately, I mean, these women, they raised money to put a statue to comfort women in Manila Bay a few years ago, and within 4 months the government took it down because they get a lot of aid from Japan and they didn't want that there.
I just want to come in here because I want to put in a note of caution about focusing too much on particular places. I'm, of course, not disagreeing with Christina at all on the stories that she's telling. But from my experience in the work that I've done on actual cases, which is a lot of cases, sadly, in my life, it's across the board. It's just universal. It just happens everywhere. No one has a national monopoly on this kind of behavior. But I think even more importantly, there is a problem or a danger of focusing exclusively, and I know that's not what you're doing, on communities where we still have people around to tell their stories. Because this has gone on since time immemorial. If you go into the history of British enslavement, slavery, okay, and the stories that you will pick up from Africa and from the Caribbean and other parts of the world, they are appalling. And we never hear anything about British acts of rape as a crime against humanity or a genocidal act in the 18th century. But it went on. And it goes on in a raft of other places. In relation to Germany's occupation of Poland, we know from the very few accounts that exist, because of course everyone was killed pretty much, so there were very few people left to tell the story. It went on an industrial scale, in concentration camps, in the killing fields around Yugoslavia and around Poland, and it went on with all sides. If you go to South America and you go into more recent history, the Pinochet era, the dirty war in Argentina, you've got exactly the same stories. I'm right now immersed in a book on the Pinochet era, and the stories are staggering, of sex crimes, rape of women in particular, just across the board.
Okay, so I want to
caution against any suggestion that there's a monopoly of horror
I don't think anybody thinks there's a monopoly.
No, I don't. I mean, honestly, I felt when I started looking into this, I felt I could have spent the rest of my life writing this because it is happening.
But then you'd have gone
everywhere.
mad.
Yes, I would have gone mad. But also, you know, it is happening everywhere, and we need to start doing something about it.
So what difference? So, Philippe, what difference? You've told us about the evolution of the law on this. What difference is that making? Is it making a difference?
So that's a very big question.
Of course, that's why I'm here.
I think, again, one has to contextualize. Since time immemorial, the state, the sovereign, the emperor, the king, the queen, was free to do whatever they wanted. There was no constraint on what they did. Until 1945, if I were the sovereign and I would say, okay, everyone on this side of the room continues to live, but everyone on that side of the room tomorrow at 6 p.m. is going to be rounded up and killed, that was fine. There was no problem with that. There was no problem in the sovereign saying everyone on that side of the room is going to be raped. There was no rule of international law which prohibited that. In 1945, there was a revolutionary moment. And that revolutionary moment was articulated in things like Nuremberg, imperfect as it was, we agree completely, on the European Convention on Human Rights, on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, on the idea that individuals and groups had rights. In other words, the sovereign was no longer free to treat its people, quote unquote, as it wanted. So that is a revolution in thinking, in human thinking, in political thinking, in moral thinking. It's a sea change. It's only 75 years ago. And you cannot expect that system to suddenly deliver Absolutely. It is a long game, and by long game, I'm saying centuries.
But
And
what
right
I'm
now,
trying
and right
to
now,
understand
hang on, and right
is
now,
what- yes.
and right now, just to bring things really close to home, okay, that settlement of 1945, this government wants to sweep away. Let's be really clear about what is going on, okay? They want to get rid of the European Convention on Human Rights. They want to get rid of international courts. They want to get rid of these international crimes if they are committed by us. Nothing about Northern Ireland in relation to justice and impunity, but okay, if these crimes are taking place in Ukraine, then we're happy to have crimes against humanity, war crimes investigations, and so on and so forth. So, to answer your question, it's a long game, and I'll take the little victories step by step, incrementally, inadequate as they are, on the construction over time of something that will deliver justice. My great role model was a wonderful professor of English legal history, Sir John Baker, Cambridge University. When I was a young academic, a research fellow up in Cambridge, once a month, it was very exciting, he'd invite me for lunch and he'd say, "What are you working on, Philippe?" And I'd say, "Oh," and he'd stroke his face. He'd say, "Ah, yes, we had a story like that in English law in 1472, and it took 294 years to sort it out." That's where we are. It's not enough, but that's where we are.
But what hope
You
is there?
mentioned the victories recently in domestic courts in Germany, which I agree, but a few, right? We're talking about a couple. But how can it possibly be okay that the International Criminal Court in the last 22 years has only convicted one person for sexual violence in conflicts?
The International Criminal Court has not convicted a single person who is not black. Okay? The International Criminal Court is in a seriously difficult situation. This is just part of a much bigger problem about how we deliver justice.
Yeah,
and
but
justice,
but what hope is there for the Yazidi women who Christina started this with? We were talking about advances in the law, and okay, context, you can have as much context as you like, and you can have history too, I'll give you that. But what I want to know is there any hope for these women to get justice in their lifetime?
Yes, there's hope for some of them. There's hope for some of them to get justice. But again, let me tell you a little story. After I got to know Jan Kisselhahn, we identified and we took witness statements, which were exactly of the kind that you got, and I went off to the International Criminal Court and met the prosecutors and gave them the material that we had and said, okay, here are some cases. We have identified some perpetrators who are physically present in countries that are state parties to the International Criminal Court, so you have jurisdiction over those people. They are not currently subject to proceedings before national legal systems, so you can exercise that jurisdiction. And what was the response? We just want to go for the top people. We don't want to go for the people on the ground who've done the act of rape. We are the International Criminal Court. We only go for the big cheeses. It was outrageous. It was absolutely outrageous.
And why do you think they said that?
They said that because they had a policy. It's changed now because they've come under such intense criticism that in relation to Ukraine, they will take literally anybody. But one of the reasons they will take anybody, again, this is just a reality check of the world of international criminal justice, is because they need some white perpetrators. Because they are being hauled over the coals, as you both know, by Africa, by South America, by Asia. Why are all the defendants... Thank God for the war in Ukraine,
then.
What?
I said, thank God for the war in Ukraine.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but again, I think what is now going to happen is the International Criminal Court will now reflect on its policy, on the merits of going only for the top people, the people who issue the instructions or turn a blind eye to their troops doing these kinds of heinous crimes, and begin to realize that actually it's very significant function of the International Criminal Court to do justice for some of the people you write about, precisely to act as an incentive for others in the future to understand, they will not be able to move. But, Lindsey, the International Criminal Court is a tiny institution. If justice is going to be done, at the end of the day, it will be done in national courts.
Right.
And that's what we should be focusing on, which is
and
why...
is that happening?
Yes, it is happening. And Germany, ironically, given if you had been in courtroom 600 on the opening day of the trial on the 20th of November 1945 and asked yourself the question, in 75 years, will Germany be leading the way on international criminal justice? People would have laughed at you. And if people had said, will Britain be, in relation to certain crimes, the global laggard, people would have said, no, we're the leaders, we invented this stuff, we're fantastic. But that is what modern Britain has become, unless it's crimes perpetrated by others. Make no mistake, the proposal to leave the European Court of Human Rights is about undoing the settlement of 1945. That is exactly what it is about, and that's what they want. So that is not a hopeful sign.
It's not. Okay, I'm going to open it out now because we've got another half hour. So, questions. Right, so we've got a lady here in a sort of rather nice auburn and black top. I can say what I want. I'm the chairperson. And
I'd be slaughtered.
we're going to bring... Do we have a microphone? Does somebody bring a microphone? There's a lady bringing a microphone to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been just incredible to hear all of you speak. So I've studied human rights law, but I'm a forensic scientist. So I think we've established there's no shortage of evidence. We've also, I think, established that ICL is really failing women. I was wondering if you could speak on women's tribunals that were done, the Tokyo Tribunal, and just other ones that have been done, trying to make...
So do women, so it's interesting. So given the slowness of international justice and so on, women's tribunals, is that something you can speak to, Christina?
You can speak to everything.
Yeah.
Go on, you start.
I mean, it seems to me it can't be a coincidence that most of the cases I know about where there has been successful convictions, there's been a woman judge or a woman prosecutor. And in some of those cases, they've gone on for years. So, I mean, one of the recent successes was Guatemala with these grandmothers, and it was 36 years ago that they were raped during the Civil War, and finally they got conviction, and those women had to testify over and over again. I mean, these are so difficult things to talk about, right? You should never have to repeat, and you know, this is one of the things I think people need to look at more, about collecting evidence, about videoing things so that people are not having to be re-traumatized by telling them. But you mentioned South America, which I think is very interesting. So I was in Argentina when I was writing this book, and I was there to give a talk about journalism. And there was a dinner, and they were asking me what I was working on. So I said that I was writing this book about war rape. And there was a lawyer at the dinner. So she said to me, that's really interesting, because do you know what's happening here? And I said, well, no. And she said, because all these cases, so Argentina during the military dictatorship, the junta, afterwards it had these sort of mega trials of lots of the military officers who, I'm sure you know, did most terrible things. They had all these torture centers. They also had these flights of death where people were flown and thrown out of aeroplanes. And they also captured pregnant women and then took the babies and brought them up as their own. I mean, really horrendous things. But I didn't know that in a lot of these torture centers, women had been repeatedly raped. And in the trials that had started in the 90s, there was no mention of that. And so one of the women I met who was kept in a torture center and gave evidence, one of the first trials, she told me, I spoke to them in the trial about being raped repeatedly in this torture center, and nobody wants to know. And they said, it's too complicated to get involved in that. We're just actually only interested in torture killing. And so she was not able to talk about it. Only now, so like almost 40 years on, they're finally now having trials on the sexual violence. So sometimes it takes
the
a
women.
very long
But these are very
time.
specific things, these women's tribunals, aren't they? You were aware of them, Philippe.
No, I am aware of them, and I read the results, and I follow what is going on. And I mean, generally, I think these people's tribunals, whether they're all women or mixed or all men or whatever they are very significant in laying down the kinds of ideas that can move in the future. I mean, for myself, I would generally opt for a tribunal that had some balanced representation of as many different sorts as possible, because a range of different views is a good thing. My own experience, I've not sat as a judge on international criminal cases, so it may be different, but I suspect that it's not. But I do sit as an international arbitrator in two different types of disputes, in investor-state disputes and in sports dispute on the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is completely fascinating. And when I started doing both, which was about 15 years ago, the panels were completely male. I didn't ever sit with a woman, even though a lot of the people, especially in the sports world, half involved female athletes. It was very weird and very, actually, scandalously inappropriate. But over time, it's changed. It's really interesting. And so now, for example, in the cases that I'm sitting on investor-state arbitration, I think I'm sitting on about 9 cases. In 4 of them, I'm the minority male candidate. And I can tell you from direct experience that it is completely different sitting on a tribunal with 2 women than sitting with 2 other men. The nature of the conversation is different. And in particular, there is a much, I mean, it's a sort of crass generalization. I've got to be very careful here. And I'm rather partial to a book that I read in the early 80s by Carol Gilligan called In a Different Voice, which some of you will have come across, that there are different ways of interacting depending on our backgrounds, our gender, our so on and so forth. But I've noticed that when you sit as 3 men, there's quite a lot of sort of ego jostling and trying to, win the argument and make sure your point gets across. The moment you sit with 2 women, it's totally different. There's just much more a desire to get to the heart of the matter, to listen, to share views, to exchange. And I suspect that what happened in Navi Pilay's tribunal is precisely that. She saw things that the men didn't see. She insisted on raising them. And she's a forceful character. Yeah. She's a
so it's
tough,
absolutely critical to have
and
women
I
in
think
this
the simple answer is it is a total transformation when you bring onto a panel. But again, I come back to other types of sexual-related crimes which aren't in the ICTY, Yugoslav, or Rwanda, or ICC statute books, namely male-on-male rape. I had a case, I did the case for Croatia against Serbia back in the late 1990s that ran for 15 years. And we got, as we were preparing the evidence to bring to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, massive evidence on male rape, male-to-male rape. And of course, the victims were utterly traumatized, didn't want any of this to be used, didn't want their names anywhere near what was going on. And so the lawyers wanted it in, but the government said, no, it's just too humiliating us as Croats to make it publicly known that we were raped on a mass scale, male to male. So there's a lot of work to be done in relation to other types of things that go on.
Okay, we've got more questions. We've got a lot of questions. We're going to have shorter answers from both of you because there's a lady there in a white shirt in the front row, and I do understand there are people in the back as well, so you will also get your chance.
Just want to say thank you for your remarks. Very, very harrowing.
Can you hold the microphone
very
closer to you?
harrowing, but very interesting at the same time. My name is Amelia, and I work at the intersection of human rights and technology. And I just wanted to pick up on a point that you made about achieving justice through the national courts. And given the scope and the extent of this horrific act that is and crime that is going on, what hope do we have to leave it to national courts, especially when we can see in the UK that it was 2% of reported rape cases.
So the hope of national
Yeah.
courts. I'm going to take a couple of questions at once, so hold that one in your mind. Lady here and gentleman next to her in row 3. So I'm going to take 3 questions there. Right here, yes. Yes, yep, she's the one. The microphone is coming to you from 2 directions at once. Right, yes, go ahead.
Hi, hello. I just wanted to bring to awareness one of the ways to help, since we talked about this
Yes.
today. There is an amazing NGO called We Are Not Weapons of War, established by Céline Bardet, who worked in ICTY. And the purpose is exactly to help victims of rape in the context of war crimes in particular.
Okay.
And so her team has developed the app for the victims to collect evidence, because evidence is still a problem in international justice. Witness statement is not necessarily always enough, and access to medical help in circumstances these people are is not always a case. But now they also will run in a few weeks an option to foster a victim. You can go to their website. It's called We Are Not Weapons of War. And these are the real ways to help for anyone to a single person. So
That's a very
just
practical and good suggestion. Thank you for that. Gentleman next to you had a question.
I'm looking at the way that society seems to be changing, and there seems to be quite a lot of pushback amongst men in power against, if you like, the more enlightened thinking around equality that's come in the last 10, 20 years. The examples of Donald Trump and now Andrew Tate, who has an enormous following of young men who are speaking about misogyny and rape as part of they're normalizing it.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious how you can...
How that fits in. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that your point is well taken, but it's a point about the broader society in which sexual violence against women happens, whereas this discussion is very specifically about war, but I think it bleeds in.
Yeah,
Just go
I
on.
think that's quite important because justice doesn't happen by accident, right? You need powerful people behind this. And I mean, unfortunately, the UN passed this resolution more than 20 years ago, 1325, to say that and every member country voted for it, to say we need to do something to curb sexual violence in conflict. And also we need to increase female participation in peacekeeping and peace negotiations, which are very related. And unfortunately, in that 20 plus years, the situation, I think, has got worse. And the female participation, I mean, there's not a single peace negotiation on earth that's headed by a woman at the moment. Most peace negotiations have very few women. The UN peacekeeping force, I think 5% are female now, when it's very clear that if you have more women, this happens less, because we haven't got into
And that
but
happens in
UN
armies as well.
peacekeepers
That
are
if
doing
you have
this
greater
too.
numbers of women
Yeah.
in militaries, it happens
Yeah.
less, which is also important.
So, yeah, so female participation generally, I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously said women belong in all the places decisions are being made, and I think having more female participation in courts, but also in peace negotiations is critical to this. But you're right in what you say, because it's very difficult. You know, the United States, when you had Trump as president, it was extremely difficult to get the United States to support anything on this at the UN. In fact, they diluted a lot of the language on some of these resolutions about sexual violence because of their own situation with abortion, and they didn't want anything that looked like they were supporting women internationally to get access to any kind of help or to have abortions if they'd been raped. Or so yeah, I think that does actually make, if you have misogynist heads of state, particularly of the most powerful country on earth, it makes things much harder.
Can I come on to the national? I mean, you've talked to us about Germany. Are there other good examples of national courts where this is beginning to happen?
Yeah, there are. I think, in answer to this question, the importance is the interaction between the international and the domestic. once you become a party to the International Criminal Court, you have an obligation under international law to introduce into your domestic law the crimes of the International Criminal Court statute and an obligation to investigate or prosecute. And one of the incentives the statute of the International Criminal Court creates is that you can avoid having cases which your nationals or country are involved in going to The Hague if you investigate and prosecute domestically. That's in part what all the debate is on about right now in relation to the troubles in Northern Ireland, because the United Kingdom has done nothing in relation to Omar. Why do you think an inquiry has been announced now in relation to Omar 40 years later? Because they've got to do something or they expose themselves to international difficulties. So that is a good example of the way in which international pressure causes things to happen at the national level. And of course, around the world generally, there is a huge amount of work to do on national courts, but a huge amount is going on that doesn't get reported daily, obviously, because there is so much that is going on. But that is why this particular moment, which we may still be in, of the Anglo-American axis between Johnson and Trump to essentially decouple these two countries from the international order, move away from a multilateral system towards a return of bilateralism, which you can control more easily, is so damaging and threatening to the possibilities that national courts can have an important role to play. The international arrangements will only ever be a backstop, and cases will be few and far between, but they send a really powerful signal, and national courts often take their cue from what's happening at the international level.
So there are people in the back who I can't even see, and they are therefore deprived. And this is an equal opportunity panel.
I'm going to take a shot since I have the mic.
Yeah, go on, go for it.
So I wanted to ask a question about, I've struck, a couple of people in the audience and on the panel have said that our domestic prosecution rate for crimes of violence of a sexual nature is incredibly low. And if you're trying to develop a theory of how you address this at an international level, if you start from the bottom up and have societies which have incredibly robust prosecutions for sexual crimes domestically, whether there's a possibility that this trickles up to greater enforcement at an international level, in part because you just get better at it and you create better norms and better laws and better evidence standards, but also because you may at a normative level start saying certain sets of crimes are beyond the pale, and then whether there's a kind of wacky double standard here that it's harder in a patriarchal world to justify certain categories of crimes against women than you may be able to justify of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, which have a particular political valence to them, and whether actually we want to strategically deploy that in order to get better accountability at a national level.
Do it on that. Okay, that's a very interesting point. Anybody else in that back area? In the dark, in the deep dark of the right-hand side. Anybody else, or was it just one hand?
There's already a microphone there.
Hi. Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah, go for it.
My name is Sagar. My interest is supply chains, because I believe most things are about supply chains, which is all about following the money and the drug trail. And my question is about this path that we are looking at for being sustainable. And we're getting the mandates from the United Nations, the WEF and the WHO. One thing people have not looked at, when I've looked at the supply chains going all the way back to Congo and all the way back to India, as one mine was shown, 200,000 people in one mine in Congo. And this is for the solutions we're looking for through renewables. My anger with this is that...
What's your question?
My question is that the UN itself has documented the sexual misdemeanors of its own blue hats.
Yes, it has its own blue helmets.
Who they've not prosecuted. And why is it that we are pushing down this path of sustainability where women in Africa and India are mass raped for these products which they are mining themselves? So if we're talking about Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, we have to look at the international aspect as well.
Thank you very much. Let's take one more question. One more question at the back there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. As someone who prosecutes and defends in cases actually also domestically and a little bit internationally, one of the things that I have noticed is one of the key difficulties in the UK when I'm trying to prosecute a case that is a rape case or a sexual case is, in most cases, the monster jumping out from behind a bush and raping someone is not the case. That's more easy to prove consent-wise. There's a difficult issue of consent that causes all kinds of problems in UK courts. In the international world, when the opposition force turns up in a village or a community or somewhere, consent isn't so much of an issue because it's quite obvious that it's not consensual. And so I'm just wondering if you can describe or help with why, therefore, it's so difficult, or it seems difficult to prosecute in the international forum, because that key issue actually isn't there. It's often consent isn't there. It's obviously
So
not.
it's
So why is
different issues that
it?
make
It should
it
be
difficult.
easier. Why
Yeah.
isn't it easier?
Should be.
Basically?
I understand that. Let me put that. We haven't forgotten the other questions, but Christina, why is it so difficult? What evidence should be there, and so on?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I mean, well, partly you say evidence should be there. It's often harder to get the evidence because it's not like if you're raped here and you go and, report and immediately have a medical examination. And this is not the case in many of the places that we're talking about. And also, often the perpetrators are the people running the area. The previous questioner was talking about Congo and the natural resources. I mean, the people behind a lot of that are people in the military or government or local militias that are controlling the areas. So it's extremely difficult to try and go to court about it because you will be killed. So that's very hard. And I think, you also made an important point, and I write about this in my book, that a lot of the rape in Congo is related to minerals and things that we use. I haven't got a phone here, but every day in our mobile phones, in our computers. We should perhaps be asking a bit more questions about the conditions in which some of these things are mined, and the fact that a lot of people are being killed or raped in those areas to get access to those minerals.
All right, so I think you've answered two of the questions. This interplay between the national and the international courts is very interesting, Philippe. So the question is really whether should we be concentrating on the national level because of all the issues we've talked about with sexual violence, or should we be concentrating at the international level, or do we have to do both?
It's a really good question. And relatedly, I think, is the up until now policy of international courts to focus on the big cheeses, to only go for the top table, because the individual perpetrators, tying to the last question, you can absolutely show the absence of consent in relation to Joe Bloggs on the ground carrying out some act of rape and then scampering off and perhaps being caught. But the international tribunals don't want to prosecute that kind of person. They want the top person, and they want the person who is articulating a policy that rape is part of the methods and means of war. But this question about the interplay between the international and the national is really interesting. It's been a theme tonight. And I want to, as we move to a close, just home in on one feel-good story, just to give you an example.
Oh, good. I was hoping for one of those.
So in the autumn of 2019, I was part of the team of lawyers that was hired by the Gambia to bring a case against Myanmar in relation to the allegations of genocide against the Rohingya community, including rape on a very, very large scale. And I've been acting for them ever since, and indeed Christina is sort of a participant in that process, so we have to be very careful what we talk about, because it's inappropriate for me as counsel to raise certain questions to you. But before we went off for the first hearing at the International Court, which was for something called the provisional measures phase, it's sort of a request for an injunction, I was in Washington on a panel at George Washington University with a former judge from the International Court of Justice, an absolutely remarkable human being called Thomas Bergenthal, who was the American judge at the International Court in the 2000s, but had started off life in Poland, and who in 1943 found himself at Auschwitz in the care of Joseph Mengele. And he somehow and amazingly survived, with his extraordinary stories written into a remarkable book called A Lucky Child. Fast forward, 75 years, and we're in Washington, and I'm on a panel with him talking about the case that's coming about the Gambia and Myanmar and the Rohingya. And he turns to me and he says, can you imagine, Philippe, if in 1943, a small African country had decided to go to an international court that didn't exist at the time, on the basis of a convention that didn't exist at the time on the prevention and punishment of genocide, and filed an application before 15 judges in which they argued that what was being done to me was an international crime and could not happen. How remarkable that would have been. And that's what happened in relation to the Rohingya. And there is some evidence that the fact that it's gone to the international court has had some effect on the behavior of the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military. And that experience signaled to me we should take our little victories and our little developments, a convention on genocide. There is a new convention finally coming into focus on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity. That is a good thing. And so step by step, a change is taking place. And coming back to these questions, the international courts, I think, have a crucial role in signaling what is and what is not acceptable behavior. And the image from that first hearing when we got the decision of the International Court, unanimous, very rare, that Myanmar must stop its mistreatment of the Rohingya, was this single extraordinary photograph, which many of you probably haven't seen, of several hundred Rohingya in a camp at Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which you've probably been to and which I haven't been to, holding up, each of them, a placard which just said, "Thank you, Gambia." And it was the moment that makes you feel, well, what we're doing is not perfect by any means, but there are moments that make you realize that this path is the right path, and it is a privilege to be on that path.
I think that was fascinating, that case, but one of the things that was less palatable to see was who led the defense for Myanmar was Aung San Suu Kyi, with a rose in her hair every day and defending what the military had done to people.
I want to finish off, Christina, I want to come to something which, because you were talking about practical things and you came up with this organisation which was very interesting to hear about. I just want to finish off, just tell us about one wonderful person, and I'm going to dictate the wonderful person that you're going to tell us about. Very briefly, just tell us about Denis Mukwege.
Okay. So, I mean, my book, if any of you've read it, is hard to read because the stories are so difficult. But there are a lot of heroes, and interestingly, a number of the heroes are men. And one of them, and he is really one of my all-time heroes, is this man called Denis Mukwege, who is a doctor from Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. He runs a hospital called Panzi Hospital, which he set up because he was worried about maternal mortality being so high in Congo. And then the first 4 women that came to him had all been raped, and really horrifically, like their vaginas had been set fire to, and he just couldn't believe it, and he thought this must be a one-off thing. And then more and more women came. And so his hospital, I mean, I'm quite sure must have treated more rape victims than anywhere on earth. They've treated more than 55,000 women and girls. And he is just this phenomenal man. He risks his life because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the perpetrators there are people in government or in the military. And so he has had assassination attempts. And his hospital is a model because he realized that actually he can repair the physical damage to most of the women. I mean, some of them, he's had to do like 13 operations because they were so badly hurt. But that doesn't end anything, that actually the trauma that they have suffered is so difficult. So then he started employing counselors, psychologists, but then he realized actually this doesn't solve anything because, as I mentioned earlier, this is a crime where the victims are often ostracized from their community, so they couldn't go home and they didn't have a way to support themselves. So then he set up a project in the hospital to actually give loans to the women, to teach them to read and write if they were illiterate, to help them set up small businesses so they could actually get back their dignity through being able to support themselves. But then he realized that even that actually isn't enough, that actually the one thing that many, or pretty much everybody I spoke to actually said was that they want justice. And so now his hospital has a legal department helping any women that want to try and take action. And so he's just incredible, and this hospital, I think, is a model for anywhere around the world.
And he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and people are following his
but
lead.
But I have to say, he said to me, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and I recommend if you Google the speech he made when he got it. It's so incredible, that speech. But he said everybody applauded, and then they just went home, and that was it. And he said, I don't do this to win a prize. I wanted people to do something about the issue.
And we have a whole audience of people here who want to do something about the issue. So that is really good. I have to draw it to a close. Philippe and Christina will sign their books. I will also sign my book. My book is the biography of Marie Colvin, who was a fantastic colleague of Christina's and mine, who was also passionate about these issues and about women and about the victims of war. I know that a lot of you have other questions, but in order to get another question to Philippe or Christina, you have to buy a book. There's no other way of doing it. But look, this was not an easy evening, and we are so heartened to see that so many people care about this issue. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you to Philippe and Christina.